4 years ago, I had the privilege to visit the salt plains in the north of Argentina for the first time. These are lands where a variety of communities of indigenous peoples have traditionally harvested salt as a living organism. These are also lands that are cultivated by indigenous peoples, including to grow quinoa, which many of you may know and eat on a regular basis as a superfood. On that occasion, actually, I saw raw quinoa for the first time, how it looks in real life. The reason I traveled to the north of Argentina was really to understand how lithium mining projects were being proposed or were taking place on indigenous lands. Lithium has been attracting a lot of international attention because it is used in mobile phones, in electric cars, and in the grids for renewable energy. And you can see it made international headlines, particularly because of its abundance in Argentina and neighboring countries. On the other hand, however, in my trip, I was accompanied and welcomed by an Argentinian NGO, FARN, that have worked for many years with indigenous peoples to protect their rights and to protect the environment from unsustainable practices. And FARN was really ringing an alarm bell about the possible negative impacts of lithium mining in that particular region because it could possibly affect negatively scarce freshwater resources that were indispensable for indigenous peoples' economic and cultural survival in that region. And so FARN was really raising awareness as well as supporting indigenous peoples in their legal claims that not all that glitters is lithium. The reason I was there, and I took this picture during the trip, was really to look at how the relationships between communities, companies, and the government were panning out, and what was the role of law in that context. This is a sign that one of the lithium mining company had placed, apparently in the middle of nowhere, to express its commitment to honesty and responsibility vis-à-vis the environment and indigenous communities. And in fairness, both companies and the government could claim that lithium mining could make a major difference to the national economy and arguably contribute to poverty alleviation across the country. They could also claim that lithium mining could contribute to global environmental challenges, and particularly the fight against climate change. But the work of FARN was showing that there were other risks, both international risks, the fact that lithium mining could undermine the reaching of other global environmental objectives, particularly the protection of biodiversity, so agricultural varieties, wetlands of international importance, migratory species such as the Andean flamingo that is found in those regions. And then there were the claims of indigenous peoples that could be seen as local in character, but are also equally protected internationally. Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, natural resources, and their culture are recognized internationally to uphold human dignity, to prevent discrimination, and also in recognition of the importance for the whole of humanity, present and future generations, of cultural and biological diversity. So in a way, this sign may appear to be in the middle of nowhere, but those claims made by the company are really not made in a vacuum. International law is quite clear that any proposed development, including mining development, that may affect lands traditionally owned or used by indigenous peoples, needs to be preceded by a prior assessment of environmental and socio-cultural impacts. That assessment will provide then a basis of information for seeking the free, prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples and finding an agreement with them on a way to share benefits arising from the proposed development with indigenous peoples in a fair and equitable manner. Now, these three things are key safeguards for indigenous peoples to protect their rights to determine their economic, social, and cultural development, and to enjoy their way of life. They're usually seen as separate, interlinked steps, and they're usually seen in a sequence. But to be honest, international law provides a picture that doesn't match reality. In many countries in the world, across different regions, most natural resource development projects do not fulfill properly those safeguards. And in particular, I think benefit sharing may be the most problematic one. Often, mining companies offer some minimum benefits, some payments and jobs, just to quickly get a yes from communities, and sometimes to put pressure on them. In the lithium mining situation in Argentina, other researchers have documented that some members of the communities have been offered payments, cars, jobs in security and catering around the mine, but many others felt that they hadn't even been asked whether they thought that the mining project would provoke severe harm to their traditional salt harvesting and agricultural practices, let alone being asked if they thought that there were any benefits deriving to them from lithium mining in that region. And so many indigenous peoples, their lawyers, and many international legal scholars really look with suspicion at benefit sharing. And my question there was, well, as an international lawyer, what is my role? How I can contribute? How can my research make a difference in this context? Particularly when the indigenous peoples and their lawyers have decided not to engage, not to rely on the international protection that revolves around fair and equitable benefit sharing. So for the past 5 years, I've been working with other international legal scholars and a political sociologist. We all reached different conclusions, but my own work has really been looking at how international law provides more than vague notions. It actually provides concrete standards to challenge current practices in the extractive sector. And the key is that those standards are dispersed in different areas of international law, particularly international human rights law and international biodiversity law. But once they're read together, they provide a very clear sense of practical steps that need to be taken for indigenous peoples' worldviews of nature, of sustainable development, to not to be just a marginal element that is squeezed into natural resource development by outsiders, but actually the very basis and the start of a dialogue about how we can build a genuine partnerships between indigenous peoples and companies and the government if certain developments may happen on their own lands. And what that meant is that there can be quite a change in the understanding of the three safeguards. Instead of being separate steps in a linear process, we can identify a strategic approach based on their mutual influences. And so, for instance, if we think about benefit sharing as something that needs to happen as soon as we start with a prior assessment of impacts, that means that first of all, we can't just go on with usual approaches to impact assessments that are led and framed by companies, and they really are focused on damage control. They really focus only on negative impacts, often mainly on environmental impacts, and very little work is done on socio-cultural impacts. Instead, if those assessments also need to take into account benefits from the viewpoint of indigenous peoples in light of their worldviews, then for one thing it is clearly necessary that indigenous peoples have to be part and parcel of that process. They need to participate directly in that assessment, and we need to use also indigenous methodologies so that the assessment will really take into account their understanding of benefits in accordance with their worldviews. And what that then means for free prior informed consent, instead of benefit sharing being offered in exchange for consent, the whole idea can be turned around. And indigenous peoples could say no to a development on the only ground that they've never been asked what benefits, if any, would arise from that project in their view. There's a third major change in current practices that can occur if we take that integrated reading of international human rights law and international biodiversity law, and that has to do with the benefits. So often the benefits are offered by companies. They identify what they can offer to indigenous communities. They're offered to them on a one-off, often top-down basis, and they really have to do on a general basis with money and jobs. However, both international biodiversity law and international human rights law have indicated that simply monetary benefits is not enough to protect the way of life of indigenous peoples. And in fact, there's been quite a lot of documentation that monetary benefits alone are very divisive for communities. And we need other benefits that can genuinely make a difference to protect existing ways of life and really ensure community well-being and vitality, including on the basis of environmental sustainability. So what benefits are we talking about? Well, I think a key one is the idea that at every step, we integrate the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, their intimate understanding of the land, of freshwater resources, of activities on those lands, in the planning of a mining project, if they wish to engage to that stage. And what that means is that then their knowledge will allow them to both contribute to a more sustainable activity, but also to take control over that activity that is proposed over their lands. And that turns into more meaningful monetary benefits. The jobs that will derive from that integration of knowledge will be jobs in the management of the mining company, and will be jobs in the environmental monitoring of the activities of that company. And that again leads to situations where you would have a percentage of profits from the company, but essentially you'll be exercising control on what happens on your own lands. There'll also be a chance to maybe have access to know-how, technologies that wouldn't have been available to you otherwise. They will become available to you by entering into a partnership with the company. And I think with that, we're really looking at a situation where the partnership changes and where the company itself is also benefiting by integrating, addressing from the inside and on a long-standing basis the question of sustainability of its own operations. Now, if we go back to the situation of lithium mining in Argentina, the indigenous communities have taken action, legal action, in several ways, mainly to protect their right to free prior informed consent. They've done so before Argentinian courts, they've done before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, as well as several United Nations human rights bodies. In all these cases, they have really focused on free prior informed consent. In addition, they have developed their own community protocol where they spell out how they understand how any outsider can approach them to discuss proposed uses of their lands in a culturally appropriate manner, in accordance with their own worldviews and their aspirations for development on their lands. And this is their way to frame and to challenge current practices in the extractive sector. So the protocol, the Kachiyupi protocol, you see the cover on the slide, it means tracks in the salt. And some of the things it says are, for example, that you can't expect consent. You can seek consent, you can engage in a dialogue, but you can never expect that consent will follow. Also, you need to consult all communities, not just some, because all of them are connected and understand the watershed, which is one interconnected ecosystem. And any project that should be proposed to companies needs to be in line with the community's worldview, which is framed as Buen Vivir, their own understanding of their intimate and collective connections to the land. So interestingly, the protocol does not address benefit sharing at all, although of course what it says is essential both for starting to understand what fairness and equity mean from the perspective of those indigenous communities, as well as providing a basis for starting a discussion on benefit sharing with them. So the reason the benefit sharing is not included in the protocol, I think is very understandable. Benefit sharing so far has not worked. It has not created the conditions for fairness and equity towards indigenous peoples. And in some cases, it has entrenched existing injustices or created new ones. But my research shows that it can be turned around. The international law at the moment provides a different understanding of what fair and equitable benefit sharing means in a way that actually is supportive and enhances indigenous people's rights to inclusive environmental impact assessments and to culturally appropriate processes for free, prior, and informed consent. And in fact, similar standards related to consent and to benefit sharing are also arising internationally with regards to conservation activities, the creation of protected areas, or commercial and non-commercial research, if it is proposed on lands traditionally owned and used by indigenous peoples. And so the main difference here, the difference that I'm hoping my legal research can provide, is really that of saying, well, even if we may have perfectly well-intentioned companies and governments who would support a wholly different process to fair and equitable benefit sharing will never be a silver bullet. Even those genuine partnerships we can imagine that can be inspired and really built upon a new understanding of all views of indigenous peoples can still lead to unintended or new sources of inequity. But at least we know that international law is detailed enough to really show that current practices by governments who have agreed upon those international standards and by companies who are increasingly expected to include those international standards in their due diligence processes, those current practices are not good enough.